Thank you, Danny. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Matthew 27. And while you're turning, I just want to remind you, we are now just 2 weeks out from Easter and our celebration of the resurrection. So there's two things that I want you to do in preparation for that. Number one, it's April 20th, and just make sure that you and your family are here. Like, I don't know what else you got going on that weekend, but I promise you it won't be as important as what's happening here. And then try to bring somebody with you. We've been trying over the last few months to stress the importance of inviting people, and honestly, Easter is kind of like the easiest of the invite opportunities. Even people that aren't normally interested are more interested when it comes to that weekend, so I hope that you'll make those connections. And the only way for us to reach people, we say this often, is for you to reach people, because we're all in this thing together, so we hope that you'll do that. Now, I've got a picture I want to show you. This is the great Ernest Hemingway. Some of you may remember reading his stuff when you were younger. If you were to make a list of great authors, his name would be at the top, or at least near the top. For several generations now, we've enjoyed stories like The Old Man and the Sea, A Farewell to Arms, and For Whom the Bell Tolls. If some of you remember those. If you haven't read them in a while, it might be good to go back and revisit them, because they're that good. Today, we remember Hemingway as this sort of timeless author who wrote these incredible stories, but it wasn't always like that. In a memoir that was published several years after his death, he went back and he described a time in his life when he was a young author, a young writer, struggling to put words on a page. It was then that he developed a writing strategy that carried him through the rest of his life. And I want you to listen to how he described it. You can tell what a great writer he was just in the way he described it. He said, "Sometimes when I was starting a new story and I could not get it going, I would sit in front of the fire and squeeze the peel of the little oranges into the edge of the flame and watch the sputter of blue they made. I would stand and look out the window and think, 'Don't worry, you've always written before, and you will write now.'" Now I want you to catch this next line, it's so good. He said, "All you have to do is write one true sentence. Write the truest sentence that you know, and then go from there." I love the simplicity of that. All you have to do is just write one true sentence. So for the last several weeks, we've been working our way through the different parts of the Easter narrative, looking at the lives of people who witnessed the events leading up to that first Easter. And one of the things that's so confusing about this, you read through all these different stories, and there's so many different characters, and there's so many compelling storylines that all seem to come together in the last week of Jesus' life, that it's hard to keep it all straight. That's why in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, there's this early church leader named Paul who gives us sort of this one-sentence summary of what this was really about. It's as if Paul knew that this would be so confusing that we would need the help. So if you ever wondered, like, what was really happening during the last week of Jesus' life, Paul answers that question with this one sentence. He said, "God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." If you go back and you read what Paul wrote leading up to that, you get the sense that like that was the truest sentence that he knew. And that everything else that he wrote was just his attempt to explore the implications of that. And so what Paul is describing there is what Christians have historically referred to as the doctrine of substitutionary atonement. And I know that's a big phrase, but it's the idea that when Jesus went to the cross, he didn't go as like a martyr. He didn't go as a victim of injustice. He didn't go as some, political martyr who got at odds with the people in power. He didn't go to the cross as a failed would-be revolutionary. He went as a substitute. He went for the purpose of taking what we deserve so that we could experience a life that only he could provide. So it's the idea that an innocent person died for guilty people like us. He took the punishment that we deserve so that we could experience both the forgiveness of our sins and the restoration of who we're created to be. So as we jump into this morning, here's the big idea for the message. It's that Jesus went to the cross as our substitute. That's kind of the key that unlocks the door to understanding what was happening that last week of Jesus' life. Like without that as the backdrop, it's easy to view all of these as sort of loosely connected stories that are kind of interesting, but once you start to see how they all lead up to that, to the idea of Jesus as our substitute, you gain a deeper appreciation for how God orchestrated the events of the last week of Jesus' life to accomplish his purpose. Now, if you're having a hard time wrapping your mind around that, it's kind of abstract. There's a story that appears in all four Gospels that's like the perfect illustration of that. It's the story of a guy named Barabbas. And actually, Matthew tells us that his name was Jesus Barabbas, which is kind of ironic when you dig into his story. As we pick up the story in Matthew 27, it's now early Friday morning. On Wednesday night, Judas, after seeing this woman anoint Jesus with this expensive bottle of perfume, he'd gone and he'd cut a deal with the religious leaders to hand Jesus over to them. On Thursday, Jesus and his disciples celebrate the Passover together. When that was done, Judas goes off. He makes good on his part of the deal. He leads the religious leaders and the soldiers to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus has been praying. And from there, it's like it ignites this chain reaction event. So all through Thursday night into Friday morning, Jesus is now in custody, and he's been forced to endure a series of trials. And he stands before all kinds of different people. It starts with the former Jewish high priest, and it just goes on like that, and all of them find him guilty. And what's so interesting, if you go back and read through all those trials, which I'd encourage you to do, nobody can agree on what he's guilty of. But the one thing they all agree on is that he deserves to die. Even though nobody knows exactly what he did wrong, everybody agrees that he should be executed. The problem for them, as that Thursday night dragged on into Friday morning, is that as religious leaders, they couldn't execute anybody. Now, they wanted to, but legally they couldn't. To execute somebody, you had to involve the civil authorities. So you get to verse 11 of Matthew 27, and Jesus is standing trial once again, only this time he's standing trial before a Roman-appointed governor named Pilate. Here's the way Matthew tells the story in verse 11. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priest and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they're bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now, if you're familiar with the story, the picture that gets painted of Pilate, I know it's hard to believe, is that he was a politician whose main focus was self-preservation. Like, that's the only thing he seems to be worried about. And so all throughout this story, all throughout his encounter with Jesus, you see him do what a lot of us like to do, and that's that he keeps trying to pass the buck. Like, he realizes this is a no-win situation. He wants no part of it. He also knows that his primary job as a member of the bureaucracy of the Roman Empire is to maintain order. Like, the one thing the Romans would not tolerate was disorder. And so he's in Jerusalem for this festival. He's got 100,000 extra people who are there. He knows this is an explosive situation, and so he's doing his best to try to put a stop to this before it spirals out of control. And so all the Gospels tell us of all these different things he did. First, they bring Jesus to him. He tries to dismiss the charges. That doesn't work. Then he sends him off to a visiting king named Herod. He thinks, if I don't make the call, maybe Herod will make the call. Herod doesn't bite. He sends Jesus back to Pilate. The second time he's there, again, Pilate tries to dismiss the charges, but the religious leaders know that they've got Pilate over a barrel. They know that they can cause a lot of problems for him, and so they play to his insecurities, and they tell him if he doesn't do what they want him to do, they're going to report him back to his superiors, which is going to cause all kinds of problems for him. By the time you get to verse 15, Pilate is an increasingly desperate man who's quickly running out of options. It's then that he hits on something, though, that he thinks might just solve his problem. Verse 15 says it like this. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At the time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. You know this, like oftentimes right before a president or a governor, somebody leaves office, what do? They issue all these pardons. And usually it's like for somebody that's connected to them, some kind of political favor, payback for some kind of, campaign contribution. And so apparently what had developed here is the Roman appointed governor during the Passover had started this tradition that they were going to release at least one prisoner. They were going to give a full pardon. And the reason they did that is they wanted to like cool all the enmity and the distrust and build some goodwill with the people. And so Pilate is formulated this response. He thinks he's going to outmaneuver the religious leaders. And so he says to them, "I'm going to give you a choice, and it won't be my choice. It'll be your choice. Who do you want? Do you want Barabbas or do you want Jesus?" And most of the time, like when we read this part of the story, we tend to focus on Pilate. But the truth is, of all the people we're introduced to in the Easter narrative, the one that we have the most in common with is Barabbas. There's three things about Barabbas I want you to see as we jump into this. Here's the first one. It's that Barabbas was guilty of insurrection. If you go back to verse 16, Matthew tells us that Barabbas was a well-known prisoner. Your translation might say a notorious prisoner. And to understand why that's true, you have to understand just a bit about the world that he lived in. So by the time Barabbas was born, the Roman Empire had controlled Israel for more than 70 years. And the one thing about the Romans that was true everywhere is that they ruled with an iron fist. And even though they had allowed the Jewish people some measure of freedom in how they worshiped, they were never really free. Like the Romans were always looking over their shoulder, telling them what they could do and what they couldn't do. And so after 70 years of that, a lot of the Jewish people had sort of made peace with that, right? They didn't necessarily like it, but they knew it was the situation as it existed, and so they just kind of were making the best of it. Except for people like Barabbas. Barabbas was not a guy that was going to make peace with the current situation. Historians tell us that he was sort of this high-profile, anti-government, like militia leader. Barabbas was a guy who spent every waking moment thinking of ways to push back against the Romans and restore Israel's independence. Now, he would have called himself a freedom fighter. The Romans would have called him a terrorist. So assassination attempts, blowing stuff up, political violence. I mean, that was Barabbas's world. Mark 15, Mark tells us that Barabbas had taken part in some kind of an uprising, some kind of a riot. Then later in Acts 3, Peter tells us that Barabbas was a murderer. So this was not a guy, make sure you're saying this was not a guy that was in prison for tax evasion. This was a guy that was in prison for starting riots and killing people and trying to overthrow the government. This was a guy, like in modern terms, you might compare him to like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, or maybe McVeigh, the guy that blew up the Oklahoma City buildings. I mean, this was a hard guy, a violent guy. He was a domestic terrorist who was guilty of insurrection. Which leads to the second thing we know about him, and that's that because he was guilty of insurrection, he had been condemned to death. The first time we're introduced to Barabbas, he's not just in prison, he's on death row. The Roman Empire was so large, so expansive, the one thing they would never tolerate was any kind of disorder, because they thought disorder over here might give rise to disorder somewhere else. And so they were quick to make an example of anybody that rebelled against their authority. And that's why crucifixions were always so public. They were meant to send a message to anybody that saw this, like, hey, if you're thinking about causing trouble for us, this is what's going to happen to you. And so the picture that's painted of Barabbas is, here's this guy, and he's been fighting against the machine, and now he's lost the fight, and he's headed towards a certain death. He's on death row. In fact, you can't prove this from the text, but most people agree that the cross that Jesus eventually wound up on was meant for Barabbas. And the reason they think that is because you get down to verse 38, Matthew tells us about these two guys that were crucified with Jesus. We call them criminals, but Matthew calls them rebels, which means they rebelled against the authority that had been placed over them. It's kind of this echo of Barabbas. And so a lot of people believe, and I think this is probably fair, that originally this was a little group of 3 insurrectionists, and Barabbas is kind of the group leader. He's kind of the man in charge. And so the first time we see him, he's waiting to die, and you kind of wonder what he might have been thinking. He's in this cramped cell, and he knows that his time is quickly approaching. And you wonder what he thought. I don't think there's any question that he knew what he was about to face. Historians tell us that crucifixion was the most brutal form of capital punishment that's ever existed. The Persians invented it, but the Romans perfected it. One ancient historian said the entire process of crucifixion was deliberately slow and agonizing, specifically designed to inflict maximum suffering. It was so intense that it was reserved for like the worst of the worst. They said even a healthy person might last for days. They'd be nailed to the cross, and they would hang there for hours, if not days, until they eventually suffocated from exhaustion or died from blood loss. It was like the most horrible way to die that had ever been conceived. And as Barabbas is in there in that cell, he knows that's his future. Like, I'm sure he's thinking about how he got in that position, but he also knows that it won't be long until the cell door will swing open, and like it'll be his number that's called, and that's what he has to look forward to. But what he doesn't know, as he waits there in that cell for his executioners to come, what he doesn't know is that not far from him, there is another drama that's playing out. There's this conversation that's happening between Pilate and the religious leaders and Jesus. And so Pilate has come up on this scheme, and he thinks he's going to outmaneuver the religious leaders. He's a shrewd political operator. He thinks, here's my chance. And he remembers that just a few days before, on Sunday, the same people who are now clamoring in front of him had celebrated Jesus as he rode into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey in what's called the triumphal entry. So in his mind, there's really no choice to be made. But then he gets hit with a curveball that he never saw coming. Verse 19. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I've suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. But the chief priest and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Which of the two do you want me to release to you? Asked the governor. Barabbas, they answered. What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah? Pilate asked. And they all answered, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify. This is the curveball that Pilate never saw coming. This is also the curveball that Barabbas could have never imagined. So if you ever get the chance to visit Jerusalem, one of the things that surprises a lot of people is how compacted everything is, right? We read these stories and we like to imagine Jerusalem as this big town and everything spread out. But when you actually see it and you explore the geography of it, everything was super close together. So here's why this matters. Historians tell us that as a condemned prisoner, Barabbas would have been held in a fortress called the Fortress of Antonia. I've got a picture, like an artist's rendering of what it looked like. You can see it's kind of made of stone, and you can also see how compacted everything is in the picture. the place where this conversation between Pilate and the religious leaders and the crowd took place was a location called the Pavement, which was outside Pilate's palace, and it's where governors often conducted like their official business. And so he's over here in one place, and Barabbas is over here in another. But if you go back, archaeologists tell us that those two places were only about 2,000 feet apart, which is about half of a mile, right? If you do the math, it's about half a mile. So it's not like super close together, but it's close enough where Barabbas may have actually heard some of what was going on. So let me explain it like this. If you were to walk out our back door and go stand by the Doughboy, right? That's probably not quite 2,000 feet, but it's pretty close. If you were to go up there and stand, and I went out in the back parking lot and I was having like a private conversation with somebody, you would not be able to hear what I said. But if you went to the Doughboy and all the rest of us went out to the parking lot and we all shouted something in unison repeatedly, you might be able to hear that. In fact, the odds are pretty good, unless like it was raining or some big truck went by, you'd probably be able to make out what we were saying. And so when you have that in the back of your mind, you realize here's Barabbas, and he's over here in his prison cell, these stone walls, and he does not hear what Pilate says, but he hears what the crowd says. And so Pilate says to them, who do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus the Christ? And everybody says, Barabbas, release to us Barabbas. Now, he didn't hear the question, but he might have heard the answer. So Pilate takes it all in, and then he says to the crowd, what do you want me to do with Jesus? And again, Barabbas would not have heard that. But he would have heard what came next when they all shouted, crucify him. Crucify him. So you can imagine, like, there's Barabbas, and all of a sudden he hears his name, like, echoing through the prison. And the next thing he hears is this demand for him to be crucified. You imagine the cold chill that must have went up his back. And so Barabbas tries to regroup, and he knows it won't be long until he hears the footsteps of the executioner echo off those stone floors. Every time I read that part of the story, I wonder, like, when they got there, did Barabbas, like, did he put up a fight, or had he resigned himself to his fate? And so that cell door swings open, and that leads to the third thing about Barabbas' story. It's that Barabbas went free because of Jesus. Barabbas went free because of Jesus. Dan Darling, one of my favorite writers, said it like this. He said, the real story of Easter, as seen through the eyes of Barabbas, the one that pulsates from this very scene and spills onto the pages of eternity, is not the injustice of a corrupt legal system or the dithering of Pontius Pilate or the dark turn of the people. The real story is that an innocent one, Jesus, died for the one who was so obviously and unapologetically guilty. Isaiah 53, 700 years before the birth of Jesus, Isaiah said it like this. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It's incredible when you think about it. Listen to how this story ends. Matthew 27, verse 24. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. And all the people answered, his blood is on us and our children. Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. It's incredible. Barabbas went free because Jesus took his place. It's the idea of substitution played out in real life. And a guilty man goes free. An innocent man accepts the punishment that the guilty man deserves. See, Pilate thought that he was outsmarting the crowd. But what he discovered is that God had orchestrated the events in a way that there was no mistaking what this was about. Frederick Buechner, one of my favorite writers, said, Pilate told the people that they could spare the life of either a murderer named Barabbas or Jesus of Nazareth, and they chose Barabbas. Now check this out. Given the same choice, Jesus, of course, would have chosen to spare Barabbas too. Part of me that wonders if he ever got over that moment. Like the text never tells us what happened to Barabbas. We don't know if he became a follower of Jesus and spent the rest of his life telling people about Jesus, or if he slowly drifted back to his old life and allowed that hatred of the Romans and that desire for political power to claim his life. But here's what I really wanted to get to. See, this is a story that's not really about Barabbas. I mean, he's a part of it, and his part's important. But as with all these stories we've looked at over the last few weeks, this is really a story about us. It's a story that shows us who we are, and it's a story that more importantly shows us who we could be. And so the three things that are true of Barabbas that we learn from this text are also true of you. Barabbas was an insurrectionist, and you are too. The problem is yours is worse. Barabbas rebelled against the Romans. You've rebelled against the God who created you. Deep down inside, all of us are insurrectionists. We don't want anybody telling us what to do or how we should live, even if it's the one who created us and gave us life. Deep in our hearts, we're all insurrectionists. And just like Barabbas had been condemned to death, you've been condemned to death too because of your sin. Romans 6:23, the Apostle Paul said, for the wages of sin is death. Because we've rebelled against God's authority, we're all deserving of death. And deep in our hearts, we're all insurrectionists. We're all self-obsessed with what we've got going on. We're all distracted by the things that absolutely mean nothing to the detriment of the thing that matters most. Isaiah said, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned our own way. That was Barabbas' story. That's your story. It's my story, but it's not the whole story, because the rest of the story and the best of the story is that just like Barabbas went free because of what Jesus did, you and I have the same opportunity. The Apostle Paul explained it like this when he wrote the truest sentence that he knew. He said, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. He took the punishment that we deserved so that we could experience life that only he could bring. He died so that we could live. And that's the story of Easter. That's the story of Barabbas, and I hope it's the story of you. But here's my question for you. Is Paul's sentence true for you? Like it was true for him, but it may not be true for you, at least not yet. I want you to imagine this scenario. I want you to imagine that the executioners come, they walk down that long cell block, and they get to Barabbas' cell. They open the door, and the jailer goes in, and he tries to explain to Barabbas what's just happened. He says something like, hey, you need to come with us. Like you've been pardoned, and somebody else took your place. And can you imagine if Barabbas is sitting there and he looks up and he says, well, I think I'd just rather stay here. And the jailer, like convinced he must have misheard, he looks at Barabbas, he says, hey, you got to come on with me. Like, we don't have time for this. You've got to go. And again, Barabbas says, I think I'd rather just, pretty comfortable where I'm at. I think I'll just stay here. And so the jailer tries to explain to Barabbas, hey, if you stay here, you're going to die. Like, if you stay here, We're going to execute you. But you can leave here and you can go out there and you can live. Now, some of you have a hard time wrapping your mind around a conversation like that because it sounds so absurd. Why would anybody choose to die when they could live? Why would anybody choose to stay in prison when they could be free? It seems like an absurd question, but you also know that's the choice most people make. And it's also the choice that some of you might have made right up until this very moment. So I want you to understand, if that's where you are, if that's where you find yourself, like you've refused to accept what Jesus offers, then I'm going to ask you to do something. It's going to take some courage. I'm going to ask you to change that today. I'm going to ask you to change it today. Just make the choice that you know you need to make. Choose what's better instead of what's most comfortable. Choose life over death. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to stand. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and he said he goes to this church, and it's a great church, but he said the guy gives these really long, drawn-out invitations. He said we go for 30 or 40 minutes every Sunday. He said, I'm convinced there's people that would respond, but they have so long to do it, they like talk themselves out of it. So we're not going to do that. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to sing 2 songs, and during this first song, if you need to pray with somebody, if you're ready to make that choice, to put your trust in Christ, to confess Christ publicly, to be baptized into Christ, to join our church family, become a part of what we're doing, I'm going to ask you to do it immediately. As soon as the music starts, if you feel the Holy Spirit prompting you to do something today, I want you to leave your seat and meet me on this front row. If you have questions, you'd like to talk with somebody, Austin's here, I'm here. We'd be glad to answer any questions you have. We can do that now. We can do that after the service. We're not going to beg you to do anything. We're not going to pressure you to do anything. But if you feel like the Holy Spirit is prompting you to accept what Jesus offers, we'd be honored to help you do that. Let's sing together.